for everyone who's here today. It's really great to be talking to you, even though it's incredibly abstract through this Zoom method. But anyway, I'm going to talk a bit about just a couple of previous works to set up to mainly talk about the work that's in the show. I just wanted to, briefly say a bit about myself. I was actually born in America and in Huntsville, Alabama, but I was brought up in England. I moved to England when I was a baby, so I don't really culturally identify with America too much, but I now live here and I teach at UCSD, which is University San Diego. And I currentently live in San Diego. So I will talk for about 30 minutes. Hopefully it won't be too boring, and then you can ask me questions at the end, if that's okay. If you have burning questions in the middle, just stop me, but it's probably better for my flow if you ask at the end of the presentation. Okay, so basically, in my practice, I have been really interested in looking through different archives of either historical events, or I often look through archives of commercials also. I have been, thinking about how history has had an influence or an effect on the present. So this video still is from a previous work called True Red Ruin. And in this project, this is like a good example of looking through a particular historical archive. And in this case, it was accounts of how a castle called Elmina Castle was first built off the coast of Ghana in 1482. It was originally storage for gold for the Portuguese. The castle went through different colonial ownership from the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and British, and went from storing gold to storing slaves as part of the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, so next slide. So me and my sister, the previous video still that you just saw is actually my sister. And so basically in this work, me and my sister and her friends perform parts of this history from the historical accounts that I was looking at. We were thinking about what happened as if it was happening now. If the castle was built where my sister lives, which is in an affordable housing estate in 3rd Ward, Houston, Texas. So through workshops and many times of us getting together, we made the work by thinking about ways in which power is embodied and how technology, in a way like thinking about the technology of the building, which was a kind of medieval style castle originally, which had towers in each corner and would have been a kind of, technology of surveillance, not only of the seas to keep invasions from happening, but also it would have affected the people who originally lived in Elmina, and because it would have served as a type of surveillance in the community. So we were thinking about, what kind of surveillance technologies affect us now. And one of the things we were thinking about in relation to that was also cell phones, which ended up being the way in which the film was shot. It was partly shot with normal style film making, but also a lot of the shots were done using a cell phone. Behind me is a redrawing from a historical map of the castle, with the castle taken out, and I left the landscape representation, and this was used as a selfie background in the video. Next slide. And so this project was also, turned into a Standee installation, and this actually is a shot from when it was shown at the Stedelijk in Amsterdam. Next slide. So the process that I use often involves drawing from archival material, which I just stated, but not only, you know, drawing from the historical events or accounts or things that I could find. And in the case of this scenario, a lot of, you know, things that were told about what happened from the point of view of the oppressor of the colonial powers, but also, you know, it actually involved for me drawing in itself. So this is an example of a set of drawings that I made from the maps of Elmina Castle, and each of these maps had the castle taken out, and they became a part of the props that served in the video itself. Okay, so next slide. You know, and other archives I have previously looked at are, in this case, a shopping centre. This is BHV, which stands for Bazaar de Hôtel de Ville, which was first built in 1870 in the centre of Paris. I, you know, was thinking about this institution, which was really significant at the height of the empire in Paris. Next slide. For this project, I also, you know, looked at an archive, and in this case, it was an archive of shopping catalogues from 1890 to the present. And, you know, through this research, I got really interested in it being a kind of pre-Amazon, the shopping online platform, and thinking about this archive as a history of how objects and consumer goods are presented to us through, you know, originally a lot of, and as you can see in this slide, a lot of it was hand-drawn illustration, and this also became photography that was often also drawn on top of, like the photography had drawing on it, which is like an early version of Photoshop, and then, you know, photography, Photoshop, and digital representations in the present. So I was thinking about how this forms of representation and image making around things that we use in the everyday, you could say they contribute to a French identity and a type of nationalism. So next slide. So within this project, which I also won't go too far into, the important part was also working with a group of young women who lived in the suburbs of Paris. And, you know, the projects were developed with these young women who were mostly second generation from colonies or former colonies of France, such as Guadeloupe, Algeria, and Martinique. Next slide. So in the workshops that spanned actually a period of 2 years of us working together, we examined and discussed the pages of the archive. And this example is the only woman of colour that we could find, despite the French colonial history, in this really, you know, long archive of shopping catalogues. That was really shocking to us. And you know, maybe there was more women of colour in that we couldn't find, but because we took a sample from a large archive, but it was kind of striking to us that this was the case. You know, in the workshops, we thought about, you know, these representations and how they often have an embedded type of racism and colonial power within them that is not always obvious. But we also discussed our personal experiences of being second or third generation from Africa and the colonies. Next slide. So the video takes these discussions and ideas that we developed in the workshops, and you know, we created a part documentary, part fictional video where the women journey through the pages of the archive, which unfold into the real streets of Paris. Next slide. So this is one example of an archive page from the 60s with this almost like army of white appliances. Next slide. And then so through the use of digital means, this became a scene in the journey of the video. So this is like one scene. And just a side note quickly that Deschamps bought his wine rack ready-made for BHV. So this became a reference to the Eiffel Tower in the background, which is really funny and cheesy. Next slide. And then also, this is a video still of Emily, and she dances crump next to a giant Nespresso coffee machine. Next slide. And then, you know, the video unfolds into the streets of Paris. And so this is one scene with these tents that are taken from a 50s camping shopping catalogue page. Next slide. And then this is also another scene where the women are journeying from the journeying on the metro with these things that seemingly come from the catalogue. And then next slide. And then there's also animation that's in this work. This is some marching objects that are you know, this is all coming from the pages of the archive. So this was one page that I found of these amazingly interesting marching, kitsching, you know, objects that are kind of protesting as if they're protesting for their own rights in some way. Next slide. And then this whole installation, this is just one example of a 4-channel installation. It was also turned into a Standee video installation where these Standees or these landscape elements were all taken from the archives and, you know, translated into this through the means of drawing. So originally they were drawn from like the archive and then translated into these Standees. Okay, so I'm gonna, next slide please. So the first part of my current focus or obsession is on Ford Motors and in particular an archive of Ford commercials that I, you know, started to get obsessed with when I lived in Detroit a year ago. I lived in Detroit for a couple of years, and Ford is a really, you know, big deal there and a significant part of the history of that city. So I took samples of Ford commercials from the 20s to the present. So in this, basically the first stage of this research project and basically a set of different works that I've made focusing on Ford. The first part was just really analyzing and looking at all of these Ford commercials, and what struck me was that they were particularly the early commercials, and to just bear in mind these are all print ads that I was looking at, and I looked at a few, you know, TVC or television commercials that are more contemporary, but I was more interested actually in these print ads that would have been disseminated around in different historical moments. So I got really obsessed with thinking about these, and the thing that struck me the most was how there were, you know, many representations of landscapes in relation to the consumer good or consumer product of a car. And so the first step to, you know, all of this work that I was am doing in relation to this is to make a piece that was about taking the cars out and in a way relinquishing or releasing the landscapes from the commercial. And, you know, just one side note, a lot of the early commercials would have been made from either watercolor or gouache. I can't quite say that word. I hope I said it right. A kind of thick type of watercolor paint. And then, you know, further down the line, it would have become photographic and digital. Next slide. So I ended up making an animation work which involved basically making a series of drawings from these commercials. This is an example of that was translated into the animation. And basically, I had to turn the landscape into layers to create this multi-dimensional space in the animation, and the layers were redrawn from the commercials, and you know I had to fill in the gap, and you can see, like, in the original, if you just skip back to the previous slide, you can see. Do you mind if you just go back to the previous slide quickly? Yeah, you can just see that there wasn't that much sky to see in this one, but then if you go back to the next slide, the next layer was drawn all the way across. Okay, so next slide, and then next slide again. So the animation uses a digital version of a technique called the Multiplane Camera, which comes out of a history of production that relates to the Ford assembly line. Basically, the Multiplane Camera in its original form was a large apparatus that was not invented by Disney, but was used extensively by Disney, and Bambi is a good example of that. It's essentially large planes of glass where each layer has a drawing of the landscape on it, and they move mechanically to create a parallax view of space. You know, and Disney was really influenced by Ford. Walt Disney, you know, I think was super into Henry Ford, and Disney ended up splitting up the production of a lot of the animations in the same way as the Ford assembly line, like splitting up the parts of not only, you know, the space of representation of the animation in the landscape, but also in the production in the factory. Next slide, and then play video.
The different elements in the scene were separated according to their varying distances from the viewer. With our original picture broken down in this manner, it is possible to control the relative speed with which each individual part of it moves to or away from the camera. The different elements in the scene were separated according to their varying distances from the viewer. With our original picture broken down in this manner, it is possible to control the relative speed with which each individual part of it moves to or away from the camera.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so in addition to looking at Ford and Disney, and actually there's a connection of Ford of Disney in relation to this, which I'll just briefly mention also, but essentially I started to also look at an archive of a Fordist colonial work camp called Fordlandia. Fordlandia was a rubber plantation that Ford set up in the middle of the Brazilian Amazon in roughly 1928. Ford wanted to bring the assembly line from Detroit to the Amazon to harvest rubber for tire production for the cars. It was a utopian capitalist project about dominating nature and cultivating the ideal worker, which was something that Ford also did in Detroit. Just a side note about the connection between Ford and Disney as an ongoing thing. Apparently, Walt Disney actually visited Fordlandia in Brazil, and Henry Ford never actually went there. So the story goes, one of the story goes, in Fordlandia, large bugs ate a lot of the crops, so they never actually yielded any rubber. And this is a drawing that which is a set of works that I, can you, next slide? Here you can see that this is actually a page from an archive that I entered in Detroit on Fordlandia, and I found these bugs, and you can see there's like a ruler showing how big they are, and I turned these bugs into car stickers, which were placed onto the glass of the drawing that you saw in the previous slide. Okay, next slide. So I was interested in this connection between the assembly line and the ideological construction of the American dream that, was really represented in these Ford commercials and in these multiple representations of landscape. I was thinking about this kind of, thinking about domination over space, and in particular in relation to the multiplane camera and perspective in general, how it kind of centers the human in the middle, as if they are the master of that space, and thinking about the connection of that. Connections of representation to a justification to dominating over space, land, and people, and also thinking about how in reality landscape is, or space and land is really complex, and there's connections of ecologies, and I think that this kind of breaking down of representation of landscape in a kind of Fordist way makes for it to be a kind of part of a collective imaginary, that it's easier to use the raw materials of space in that way. So the assembly line of the image was something that I was thinking about, and the production of the imaginary. So in the end, I often do the thing that I critique. So I ended up making a 19-minute long animation. It's super long and maybe a bit boring, but essentially, you are taken through the spaces of these Ford represented landscapes, and you are basically moving through and many empty spaces, because the car and the people are taken out, and it's sometimes watercolors, sometimes it's digital spaces, sometimes it's photographic, and you're just like on this journey of space in relation to Ford. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to just show a short clip of this animation. It's one section that I selected because you can see archival footage of Fordlandia in this part. The whole piece has many parts that look very different to each other, but this gives an indication of the relationship between using watercolor and then photographic and digital. So yeah, if you could play the clip, it has sound. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. This is another section to this animation. We can come back to it if you want, but I'm going to skip that. So next slide. Oh, yeah, there we go. So, okay, so essentially the work that I am showing in the gallery here was really, it came out of that previous project that I just shown. But this time I got obsessed with this one advert from 1965, which is a Ford Lincoln car ad. And Lincoln Cars was like a sort of luxury car that Ford put out, a type of like a real aspirational car. And this advert features a white woman in a pink suit and an American orchard or wood in the background with a private road sign. Next slide. So I wanted to make a simple animation of this space without the car or the white woman in it, and to like move deeper into the space of the forest, and so that you couldn't see the private road sign anymore. You know, I'll explain it a bit more next as I go. Next slide. And I was also looking at a bunch of Ford commercials where it was raining. And so these are some examples. And I was thinking about the car as a refuge or a kind of private protection or home from outside elements. Next slide. And then at the same time, I was also looking at rain in Disney films as a kind of like pathetic fallacy of something bad or something, you know, tragic about to happen. Next slide. So what has been left out of this image? You know, this image uses land and people. I mean, it's not this image, but the actual production of this car uses land and people's labor to make the car. I was thinking about how the image is this ideological illusion of some sort of, you know, perfect private life. And I was really thinking about how, you know, in order for this person who owns this car and, you know, may even own this private road, there's a lot of oppression that needs to happen for this to occur. So I was thinking about like the taking of land from indigenous and black brown people, and, you know, for this privately owned land and private accumulation of wealth. And so in the work, I was, you know, thinking about how to, I don't know, it's like one of those things like when you look at a lot of images that don't include you, or I think, you know, you see a lot of things that are kind of like, how do you say, selling us a dream that is not possible for most of us, and is also, you know, really not the future that we should be engaging in. So I really just wanted to make a simple work with this project where, you know, by moving forward through the space of the animation and using this technique that you could say is quite problematic, you just end up moving through the space and away from the original image. So the animation starts from the point of view of this commercial without the car and without the woman, and moves beyond the private road sign and moves through the space. Next slide. And then next slide again. Oh, you can show a little, I mean, you guys may have seen it, but I just put a clip just in case. So it just moves through this space. And then next slide. And then, you know, as you move further and further, it starts to rain heavily in the space. And then next slide. And then the geography becomes more like a jungle, or so the forest moves into a jungle-like forest, connecting these separate geographies, and thinking about this connection between Ford and other places in which, you know, this kind of colonial capitalism that has to happen in order for certain things to be, you know, created, that didn't have to happen, but that capitalism sees to have to happen. Okay, so next slide. So the last link in the show is Amazon, not just Amazon the forest, but Amazon the company, and more specifically Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is part of the Amazon group of corporations, which started in 2005. Amazon Mechanical Turk is a crowdsourcing platform that allows for a gathering of mass data from human labor. Requesters post hits human intelligence tasks to gather data, and this data often comes in the form of questionnaires or image identification and other types of what they call click work. Human labor to feed AI machine learning. And there are many workers situated all around the world, but mainly in the US and India. And large forms of data can be gathered by large corporations on this platform, and it's a kind of a new kind of global assembly line. The data can be used for many things: to test adverts' effectiveness, to teach computers mass data for artificial intelligence, but it can also be used to manipulate people. There's just an example of Cambridge Analytica using Amazon Mechanical Turk to gain access to the workers' Facebook accounts. Next slide. So I have focused on thinking about the workers on this platform. There are other platforms, similar platforms that do this similar thing to Amazon Mechanical Turk, but I just mainly focused on Amazon for now. I really was focused on thinking about the use of human labor to create data. What type of conditions are these workers in? Whether the work is fulfilling? What kind of life does this type of work offer or enable? Or what kind of future does it suggest for us all? A lot of people use the platform for multiple different reasons, because they might not be able to go into work for potentially because of disabilities, or because they have to do childcare. You know, many, many reasons why people maybe even prefer to work this way. And actually, in particular now, because of COVID, there's even more people working from home and are also unemployed, so are turning to this work. The platform is about data, but you know, you don't ever get to see that there's people behind the work, that it's actually, you know, significantly about using humans to maybe ultimately create machines that could take over work even more of humans. But I think that the future of work is just changing for humans. I think they'll always need human labor. Okay, next slide and play video.
Hi, my name is Erica. I'm a part-time MTurk worker. I do not work full-time consistently throughout the year. I work full-time as a teacher, actually. I teach middle school science. One of the main reasons I work part-time on MTurk is that I just don't consistently make enough money as a teacher throughout the year, between just to pay my week-to-week bills, pension contributions, and student loan payments, and just my salary not being consistently high. I work part-time on MTurk.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is just a few of the people who I'm currently working with. We're doing like Zoom workshops to develop a piece that I will, you know, briefly talk about, which is what I'm currently working on. Next slide. And I just wanted to show you this really quickly, because this is Amy, who is one of the participants of the film I'm making, and she was really excited about how in her home she has a snake and a lot of stuffed animals that she thinks would be really connected to Fordlandia, which is maybe funny. Okay, next slide. So this is Mohammed Wajid's bed. He works for MTurk from his bed, and this is a quote that he told me. I work at home. During the daytime, I work in the living room, and during the evenings and nights, I work lying on my bed. I just put my laptop beside me, and I sleep and wake up during the nights just to check if there's any new work available. As of now, I don't mind sleeping on the same bed with the laptop beside me. For me, money is money and is very important rather than total comfort. Okay, next slide. And so, as you can see, the window display connects to this series of works that I had been doing, which is, you know, just a kind of development in the process of this project, which is to do with thinking about the place of work of the MTurk workers' space, and this kind of relationship that this has to kind of you know, global network of the marketplace. So it's like from the home, you're like having to journey online in order to make work. And so I was interested in like putting these landscape layers in front to suggest this kind of connection to the, you know, this it used to be that one would journey from afar or through forests or through many places to get work, but now we're having to do that online. Okay, so next slide. So, you know, basically, I'm currently developing a video work which will be a reenactment or a retelling of Fordlandia, which, as I explained before, Fordlandia was this supposed utopian work camp in the middle of the Brazilian Amazon. I'm thinking about this as a way of thinking about embodied power and control in contemporary forms of labor, such as Amazon Mechanical Turk. So the people that I've just shown you are willing and involved in making this work, and so I will work with Turk workers, and we will come together, have discussions and play and work in opposition to the platform and make this video. Originally, before COVID, the idea would be that I would actually bring workers from all around the world together to shoot the work in person, so that it was this kind of opposition to the separation of how, a lot of the time, because you're working on your own at home, there's not as many opportunities of collective solidarity or making, coming together to create a kind of moment of revolt because of the separation, and that suits this platform. Although there is a lot of online organizing that happens, it wouldn't be often possible to meet in person. But because of COVID, I'm not sure if that part will happen for a while. So we're meeting together through Zoom, and the work is being translated through this kind of use of sending props to the different participants. Next slide. So in Fordlandia, time clocks were smashed during a riot. A whistleblower who has dirt on Ford was accused of being a diamond thief to discredit him. Workers were expected to work during the hottest part of the day. Ford insisted the workers ate tinned peaches instead of the abundance of foods that the forest or the Amazon forest had to offer. There was many irrational decisions that were made. Next slide. So through this project, I want to think about and highlight the indigenous worker that Fordlandia, used for this workforce, and think about the kind of colonial aspect of this, and connect it to Amazon Mechanical Turk, and how that also relates to an aspect of race and class, that the workforce, often for Amazon Mechanical Turk are a workforce that are a kind of disposable form of labor. Next slide. And also thinking about always being available for work that, sort of stemmed from a type of Fordist assembly line, and how this is disseminated out into the digital world, separating out the work, and being consistently or continually available for work. And these are the things I'm thinking about in relation to this new project. So next slide. So Fordlandia is already a fable of what not to do, a fictional story that perhaps we are still living through. Perhaps this mining of cultural archives through reenactments and re-representations could lead to a more radical way of thinking about arrangements of labor and work. Okay, that's it. Thank you. So, I don't know if you have any questions.
Any questions?
I have one.
Yes, please.
To kick it off. I noticed that in several of your works, you choose to leave out things. What do you choose to leave out? Why not alter in a different way? Why not add, for example?
Wow, that's the first time anyone ever said that, because sometimes I feel like I put too much in, but maybe that's because I've only shown a few projects here. But maybe, are you talking about like taking out cars and leaving the landscape?
For example?
Yes.
But also taking an island which contains a castle and then used for slave trade, and then removing the castle. It seems to me that you are removing the essence of your work?
I don't think that if it's a matter of opinion, but I wouldn't say that a kind of colonial castle that was once, a big part of the development of global capital that we know now is something that, should be the essence of my artwork, in the sense of celebrating that. So in terms of taking the castle out and leaving the landscape, it was about thinking through, how to both think about the people who would have been imposed by that castle. So, there was a moment in history where that castle didn't exist. So that was something that I was thinking through in terms of that work, like thinking through the moment of imposition of that castle. So using abstraction and removing it was a way of discussing that. And then in regards to the removing of the car, I suppose that's exactly the same thing. It's like, connecting landscape to a consumer product such as a car is such a massive part of our collective consciousness, and particularly in America, it's like freedom and freedom of space is related to an individual owning a car. And I think there's a problem with that. So I was thinking, okay, so the simple gesture of maybe removing the car, what's left? I was interested in that representation of what was left beyond the car.
Any other questions?
Why were you interested in looking into the archive of Ford cars with the rain? And then you added in the animation. Why were you interested in the rain?
So I got really interested in the rain partly because of seeing these commercials, these Ford commercials that use the rain as this emotional connection to being protected by the car. And so that was the beginning of it. And I don't know, like I had this, before I even committed to making the work, I was like, oh, I really want to make a work where it rains and there's no like car to, or house to protect you from the elements. I mean, not that, seeing the representation is not that, but I was just interested in thinking about the rain as this, symbol or emotional connection that these commercials use to, think about, private protection, and both in terms of a car, but also private ownership of houses and land and all those kinds of things. So it's a bit of a leap, but I also thought it was a nice thing to think about in terms of the rain as a kind of renewal, but also a kind of emotional connection to rain as this thing that might, symbolize a moment of something going wrong as well, but it also does bring a lot of change and renewal.
Yeah. Was it also not connected slightly to how Disney films use rain often in sort of before that, something tragic is going to happen?
Yeah, and I was also thinking about that it's this, I don't know, it's also something about the animation of rain, and I tried to work with a hand-drawn animator that I often work with to be able to get this rain to look a bit more, less simulated and more like hand-drawn animation, but I do think that it didn't completely work, so I'm gonna go back into that and think about that, because I think that the way that the rain hits the ground looks quite simulated, so we didn't get a chance to develop that part, but the drop of rain that happens on the leaf, that was hand-drawn. I mean, everything's hand-drawn, and it's just that, After Effects have these simulated tricks that you can use, and so there was a little bit of use of that in terms of the way the rain interacts with the ground. That's a lot of details that you might not care to know. It's hard to read the room when you're in a...
Anything else?
I'm not quite sure what my question is yet, but I was just noticing that quite often maybe like the symbols, or actually not symbols, but the use of like the castle and the car are quite kind of like masculine, like, you know, the typical idea of the masculine, but then you also use women a lot, or it seems like empowerment of women is important in your work, and I was just wondering if, yeah, maybe, I'm not sure what my question is, but if you could talk about that.
Yeah, that's great. I really think about that. And yeah, because I also, well, there's a few things about that which I didn't really go into in this presentation, but one aspect of that is that actually a lot of history of advertising really relates to women, because you know, some early commercials were mostly targeted to women, and actually a lot of early Ford car commercials were targeted to women, and they would have used, I think that, you know, that, I mean, it's a kind of, I don't know if you guys have ever read or about Edward Bernays and the kind of ways in which, you know, masculine, sort of psychoanalytic masculine symbols, and how he connected that to cigarettes. And, you know, there's a lot of things about that happen in commercials that maybe, you know, work on an unconscious level. So that is something that I do think about. But then more specifically, I'm really interested in, you know, working with women and women of color, or just generally, you know, thinking about working with people who might not be, you know, fully, how do you say, included in the capitalist project in its kind of extreme sense. So there needs, for capitalism to succeed, there needs to be a lot of people who aren't succeeding. And for me, that, you know, it's not just women of color, but I often, you know, maybe because I am a woman of color myself, that's what I, you know, I like to, as a kind of form of solidarity, or a type of maybe even like in opposition to the ways that capitalism works. That was a ramble. I don't know if that. I don't always work only with women, and it's just that a lot of the time I do. I'm not only working with women right now. Yeah.
I have another comment. Sure. So I work with Turk, which is an art space in Rotterdam, and last exhibition we had an exhibition where a German artist, he interviewed people who worked online, like how do they work and what do they feel about it, and then I did an interview with him, and then he said actually when he interviewed these people who do the online work, those people who mostly don't use English as their mother tongue, they often feel like they are the entrepreneurs because they make extra money and they can use English to communicate, to get work. They kind of feel proud about it, whereas when we are here, we use English almost every day. We feel completely different about this online work, so I'm just wondering if when you get in touch with the people that you showed in the slide, did you get the same feeling that they feel quite proud about this work, or they don't like it, they just had to do it?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, and that also was something that came up in the project that I did with my sister as well, is this thing about, you know, I might be against I mean, it's not that I am against the Amazon Mechanical Turk. I think it's an awful corporation, and but I try not to impose my views on the situation. I feel like it's about, you know, connecting and working through the research that I am bringing research to the table, and there's certain things that happened in these historical accounts that we can discuss in relation to the workers' current situation. And what might happen is, for sure, what you just said, that some people, you know, already are like, yeah, I love working on this platform because I can run my own schedule. And so that's, to me, is super interesting, and I'm not going to, you know, impose my view upon that. But I do think that in putting it in relation to a historical situation, then you can create a kind of dialectic where it's like, yeah, maybe someone might be really happy about being able to work whenever they want, but on the other hand, how do they feel about the fact that they might have to be available all the time because that's what the platform needs you to be? So this supposed freedom, I mean, it's always comes down to that. It's like, you know, what we think is going on. I mean, it's also, again, it's about this ways in which power becomes embodied. So how do you deal with those different aspects of, like, well, you know, maybe there's some conversation we can have about those things together within the workshop, and then how does that come out in the work? If that makes sense, because I think that not everyone, you know, not everyone is a revolutionary, you know, they're not all going to be like, let's, so I have to be really careful. This project hasn't been made yet, but I already have encountered all of those different things, and I'm excited about it, and I'm finding ways to, you know, allow the work to take on its own identity and space without me having to, like, I'm not trying to control it all. In fact, that's what is more exciting about working with humans. I have this practice where I work on something like an animation where I can control every aspect of it, and then I'm like, okay, I need to work with people where I can't really control everything, and it's usually that work is the most exciting, but I also really enjoy doing the other stuff at the same time. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, I'm curious, did you actually make those watercolors that we have in the front space yourself?
Sorry, say that again?
Did you make those watercolors from the archives that we have in the front room? You made them yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, they're originally a watercolor. I mean, are you asking me, do I have assistants?
Yes.
I do have assistants. But I can paint, and I often do it myself, but there's a lot of work. So sometimes I also work with assistants who help me, if that's the question.
Yeah.
But the other side of that is that they are watercolor originally and scanned and printed. They're watercolors from the archive that I was looking at in Detroit.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Do we have a last question? Okay. Then we should say thank you so much, Danielle.
Yeah, thanks.
Great.
Thank you.
I'm very happy that technology was on our side this day.
Yeah.
Sort of, at least.
Oh, was it hard to hear what I was saying?
No, I think it was very clear, and yeah, it was very good.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah.